Yeah, why don't I just start so I can introduce you and then we can pick up from there. So um, I just want to welcome everybody from New York to Michigan to Baltimore and every place, and Arizona and every place in between, to tonight's talk with Doug Becker on entrepreneurship as a force for good. We always, as I mentioned to Doug, we've always done these in person, and then we'd go to dinner and he would spend a day with us. Unfortunately, we'll have to take a rain check on that. But it's really kind of him to join us tonight, because I think one of the things we tried to do in this crazy COVID era is keep as many things the same. And I think this is, I think, the seventh talk or eighth talk this year. So I think it's gone well, and it's really an honor to have Doug with us. And let me tell you a little bit about Doug. Some of you in the audience do know him well, but uh, Doug has had an amazing career. So first of all, he's from Baltimore, and he went to Gilman and the college in Baltimore. And he's currently the founder and chairman of Cintana Education, which I know he's going to speak about, which is this amazing company that's looking at changing the world of education, which means that it's a global vision, not simply looking locally. He was the founder and CEO of Laureate Education until a couple of years ago, which literally, at the time he was running it, had over 1 million students at 70 campuses around the world. When you go back further, Doug literally started companies while in high school, and he'll speak about that. And Sterling Investors and Sylvan Learning Center and everything that relates to that was something he helped found. And he's also, besides being an entrepreneur and doing all of these different things in education and many other different disciplines, he also has found the time to give back. And if you're a Baltimorean, you kind of know he was the founding chairman of Fort Discovery, the Children's Museum in Baltimore, been involved with Baltimore Museum of Art, Greater Baltimore Committee, Economic Alliance of Baltimore, Gilman School, University of Maryland, and he's on the board of trustees at Hopkins and Johns Hopkins Medicine. So it's really an honor to have Doug with us tonight, and he'll be speaking about entrepreneurship as a force for good. Doug, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Great. Elliot, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for turning out for this. I told Elliot I didn't want to break his streak. He seems to always get a great turnout for these things. And I was a little concerned that I might not be the big draw. Like, I know my brother was once one of your previous speakers, and I'm sure he would have done better. So later we'll have to compare, as brothers would, like who got the greatest number of attendees, which of us did our mom think did a better job of speaking. We'll work on all that. But thank you so much, Elliot. It's actually a great service that you provide to the Hopkins and Baltimore community to do these speeches. I know the first time when you talked to my brother about this, Eric, and he was really excited and really just loved the experience. So the Zoom experience is obviously not the same, although it does allow us to very conveniently connect. I'm in Arizona today, and so otherwise I couldn't have been there. So I'm really happy about that. So welcome to your audience. I really want to start by just saying how much I appreciate the Johns Hopkins community. Being in Baltimore, it not only is such a major factor in the community, but of course, so many experiences of friends and family members who've been helped by Hopkins and the wonderful leadership and staff and medical teams throughout Johns Hopkins, and from my service on the Johns Hopkins Medicine Board. I've just come to learn so much more about what Hopkins does, not just in Maryland and in the US, but of course all over the world. So a big shout out, Charlie, to you and Hopkins International. I am really happy that some of my family members could join. I know my daughter, who's a college student, was going to be joining, and I think maybe a couple of my wonderful nephews, and my mother, if she is online. I just want to blow her a kiss. I positioned myself with a great light behind me because I figured that's how she sees me anyway. So that's great to be together here. So Elliot asked me about the topic, and while I've had a kind of a varied career and feel like I've been incredibly fortunate, the two themes that to me have always been very constant that I thought I might talk about today a little bit. One was this idea that I could make a positive impact helping people through whatever else I was doing. And that was always very important to me. And I'll kind of explain why and how. And then I always have defined myself as an entrepreneur, which is sort of interesting up until a few years ago when I was running Laureate Education. Laureate had become a really big global company with 70,000 employees. And running that company, I didn't feel like an entrepreneur at that point. You're running a very operationally intensive company. Obviously, Hopkins itself, just massive in scale. And in some ways, nothing could be more different than the idea of being an entrepreneur or running a large organization. And I feel really lucky to have been able to do both. But I define myself more as an entrepreneur because that's how it all started. And because I think of entrepreneurship, I think of it with reverence. I think of it as a problem-solving mindset and toolkit, and a mentality of not giving in or giving up. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit today. So those two themes, hopefully doing something positive for others and being an entrepreneur, coming together to say, can entrepreneurship be a force for good? Elliot mentioned just a little bit about my background, and I will tell you a little bit more about that, but just a couple quick points because they will explain the entrepreneurial experience. I did have a chance to co-found a healthcare technology company when I was 17. I still look back on that as kind of hard to believe that it even happened, that it was sort of a strange dreamlike experience that this could have even been possible for me. And I was lucky enough to have my brother and two of our closest friends as partners to help launch that business because I was 17. I knew nothing and they knew slightly more than I did, but they helped. And then I did have a chance to found over the, let's call it 30 years after that, I moved into education and founded 6 other education companies or co-founded. I'll talk to you just about a couple of those. I don't want to use up all of our time on that. And then did have the chance to take one of those companies to a very massive scale, which was the Laureate experience, a wonderful firm still in Baltimore, not the same. The companies morph and change if indeed they're going to last at all, but a wonderful company and wonderful people in the Baltimore community that I really love. And so why this topic, entrepreneurship as a force for good? I think I would start with the idea of business as a force for good. So there are a lot of people, and I think about the medical community, for example, at Hopkins, I'm sure there are people with very different points of view about business. Business can be viewed as something great, job creation and a driver for the economy, or business can be viewed as something kind of evil. And I think the answer is it is both, but it is a force. And whether you want to think of business as sort of an expression of capitalism, if you want to think of it as a font of innovation, it's all of these things. And entrepreneurship is kind of a subset within business, and also, as I said, maybe even more of a mindset than a business category per se. But I do want to talk more about the entrepreneurial side. But I want to start with this idea of business as a force for good. It has pained me when I see people who are really cynical and mistrustful about business, and it pains me in part because it's true, but it also pains me because it isn't always true. And so for me, that's always been an important theme. I'm going to talk a little bit about education. I did have a chance to develop this incipient tutoring company called Sylvan Learning Centers. That was a great experience and part of what I'm going to talk to you about as well today. So let me start with my definition of what is an entrepreneur. And I'm not going to go to any dictionaries for this. I'm just going to tell you what I think. I think of being an entrepreneur as a tremendously creative pursuit. And over time, as I've had a chance to reflect on it, I realize it is really what I love about it is the creativity. Whether you're creating a product that's innovative or a service or a company, how you design your company, how you design the organizational structure, the mission of your company, what problems you choose to solve, because in the end, most necessary products and services are intended to solve some sort of problem. So I would start by saying I think there's enormous creativity to being entrepreneurial. Now, once a company achieves scale, the only way they can do something reliably over and over again is to probably become a little bit less creative and become very, very strong on process. And I think about sort of the checklist mentality that pilots use when they're making sure that a plane takes off and lands safely. Of course, I know in medicine, that's also very, very common. I was reading an article, I'm sure many of you were reading about this vaccine manufacturing company in Baltimore. I don't know much about the situation, but watching what seems to be breakdowns in reliable processes was pretty alarming. But at the entrepreneurial level, you're way before any of that stuff happens. You're creating something that you're not even thinking about scale. You're thinking about something creative that's going to solve some sort of problem or need. And look, a need could be somebody wants a pack of gum. It doesn't have to always be something that is a high calling, but a need can be a high calling. And as I go through my experience in health and medicine and then in education, it did feel to me like a high calling. It felt like a huge responsibility, but very motivating to think that what I was doing might impact people, or people use the expression change the world. I don't really know if anything that I ever will do will ever change the world, but I sure love to think that it might. And so there's inspiration in conceiving a company and trying to be an entrepreneur. So in the end, I would say, to me, being an entrepreneur is somebody who is creative, who's trying to solve a necessary, hopefully important problem, and somebody who is going to be pretty driven, pretty relentless about not giving up until that problem has been solved. Because that's, I think, in the end, the big difference between a business undertaking a new product or venture, which happens all the time, and an entrepreneurial journey, which tends to be something where people just are not going to give up, sometimes to their detriment, but sometimes that is what's necessary to solve a really, really difficult problem. And I have to remind myself, now I've started what is now my 7th education company, this company that Elliot mentioned, Cintana, that is actually in partnership with a wonderful university out here, Arizona State, which is where I am today. The very innovative university, also very large. We're having a great collaboration. But I have to remind myself, 2 years ago, I was running a company with 1 million students and 70,000 students. And today I'm trying to start something new, and it's hard and things don't go the way you expect. And the expression I know my brother and my business partners and I always used was being scrappy, coming up with creative solutions to problems, and trying to get things done and not give up. So those are just some thoughts about entrepreneurship. And then how does this lend itself to the idea of being a force for good? Well, you can apply entrepreneurship towards the goal of creating a better pack of gum. You can apply it towards the goal of trying to make money. I actually always view that as maybe something that would happen if you accomplished all your other goals, but to me was not intended to be a goal in and of itself. But I think for some people it is. And in my case, really looking for the idea that we could solve big problems and make a difference for some different people. I thought back in preparation for this speech today, what made me want to be an entrepreneur. My brother and I, when we grew up, we used to go visit our father at work. He was an entrepreneur, Gordon Becker. He's still with us, but not in business anymore. And he had a company that started as an entrepreneur. Literally, he had a school for Santa Clauses, if you can imagine that. I don't think that was a particularly big business, but I know he had fun with it in college and then created a company that provided Christmas decorations to shopping centers. And he built it into a leading company in that niche. And it was just great to watch him and his passion for, more than anything, his passion for his customers. And he would bring me to business meetings with him. I was 8 or 10 years old, and I would sit with him, and I could just see he loved the idea of just engaging with his customers, meeting their needs, making them happy and proud of what he did. And he was very passionate about that. So I would go to work with him, and that was a great experience. And I know my brother would say the same thing, that that's really what gave me a taste for the idea that it's possible to just start a company. Because I think a lot of people don't do it because they can't, but a lot of people don't do it because they don't even think it's possible. And then just I learned so much from him over the years. But before that, I actually wanted to be a doctor. So that might be good news or bad news. I'm not sure, for the many, many gifted medical professionals and healthcare professionals who are on the call today. I think I probably did you all a favor by not becoming a doctor, because I don't know how good of a doctor I would have been, but that's what I wanted to be. And I had the chance to volunteer in a volunteer job at the Curtis Hand Center at Union Memorial Hospital when I was a junior in high school, so around 17 years old. And a wonderful local doctor that some of you may have known, Rick Hansen, who was a plastic surgeon. Somehow, through a friend of my mother's, I connected with him, and I knew he was involved with the Curtis Hand Center, and he gave me my first volunteer job. I also had a part-time paying job as working at a computer store, Computerland. If anybody here even remembers Computerland, there used to be one out in Lutherville, and a couple of wonderful entrepreneurs who started and ran that computer store and are still in business today, but not with that name. And I was working part-time selling computers in the earliest days of microcomputers, the IBM PC Junior, for anybody that would even remember that horrible computer. And Elliot, I think of you as so technology literate. You know what I'm talking about, when the 5 megabyte hard drive was the size of a coffee table. So people would come in, and 17 years old, I was a technology geek and loved explaining how everything could or couldn't work. Probably wrong, but I did my best. And sold and supported people who were buying computers. And then my volunteer job was working in this research lab, which was the microsurgery research lab at Union Memorial in the Curtis Hand Center. This was where surgeons were taught how to reconnect severed items like fingers and hands and other things through reconnecting arteries and veins and nerves. And so that was the most mind-blowing experience for me, 17 years old, sitting in that lab. My main job was to take care of the rats that were the poor victims of all of the trials of doctors that were learning how to do this. And but I did get a chance to sit in and watch this microsurgery being done, and it was just so interesting. And I remember Dave Seiler, who was the tech at that lab, who would let me, when the doctors weren't around, he would let me actually try to reconnect rats' arteries and veins under the microscope. That was probably illegal, by the way, but I don't know. Thank you, Dave. And I really enjoyed that. My favorite story about that is, rats, I'm sure many of you know this better than I, but rats are pretty smart. And so when you're a rat and you've been taken out of your cage about 5 times and shaved and cut open so that somebody can reconnect your arteries or your veins, eventually you really know what's coming when that hand comes in the cage. So these rats were very smart, and it was always kind of me against them. Maybe that's where I learned to be, problem solver, scrappy problem solver. Was I remember at one point I filled a medical glove with hot water, and I would stick it in the cage so that the rats would learn that if they bit the glove, that they would get burned. And then that was my solution. I put my hand in the glove, and then they never bit me again. So that was pretty fun. But I loved that experience, and I loved the chance to get to know and work with Dr. Hansen. But as I was sitting in at Union Memorial and watching people come in and out of the hospital, and I could hear, because I was there all the time, people would say, do you have your x-rays from your last visit? No, we don't have that. Did you know that these 2 medicines that you're taking are interacting with each other and could make you sick, or could actually cancel out the benefit of the medicine? All these factors, and as a computer geek, I was so curious as to why somebody couldn't just computerize a medical record. And I know a lot of you are probably laughing, because I think even today it's harder than it sounds. But back then there were very few tools to do that. And to make a long story short, I did start a company. I went to Dr. Hansen, and I said, I really think that with today's microcomputers, we could build a distributed system to store medical records and automate that process. He thought it was a great idea. He was very supportive. I went to Big Brother because he was in college and I was in high school and he knew more than I did. And he was always interested in business. So I knew he would be a great guide for me. And then I went to two of our best friends, one of whom had gone to high school with Eric and with me. That's Chris Hohensarig, who many of you may know and who served on the Hopkins board for many, many years. And then a partner, a friend of my brother's from Chicago, where he was living and going to university at the time. And we started this company called LifeCard. I had read about a technology on the West Coast, which was essentially a laser read coating that you could put on a card, a little bit like a compact disc or a DVD, but instead of putting it on a round platter, they put it on a card that you could carry in your wallet, like your Blue Cross and Blue Shield card. And this was one of the first storage devices that would use optical coding of this nature. And I read about this, and I don't know what possessed me, but I did pick up the phone and call the inventor, this very interesting person out in California named Jerry Drexler. And I said to him, I'd like to find applications for your card. I think it's really cool. I want to go make that happen. My first idea actually originally was to see if we could automate car maintenance records because one of my customers at Computerland was one of the founding franchisees of Jiffy Lube. And on Saturdays, I was tutoring him in basic programming. And I told him about this card, and he says, wow, we should automate maintenance records for cars. But that's when in my mind, I thought, wait a minute, all of the things, the dysfunction that I'm seeing at Union Memorial's, let's say the lack of computerization on records, maybe a human's maintenance record would be more important than a car's maintenance record. And I had the chance to bring this idea to Rick Hansen. He introduced me to Blue Cross and Blue Shield. He introduced me to Tom Sherlock, who at the time was the CEO of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Maryland. And my pitch was, take this card and make the back of it your Blue Cross and Blue Shield card, so that is the card people carry around in their wallet anyway. And at the time, there wasn't enough bandwidth to do things like send X-ray images, Elliot, like you do all the time. That would have been difficult to do back then. This is more than 30 years ago. And this was a distributed system. People would have a card in their pocket and it would have their medical record on the card. And Blue Cross and Blue Shield, I remember those days with my partners. Thank goodness they were smarter than I was, but I was the front man on this in our little band. And they brought in their mainframe experts, and they said, how is this going to work? And Chris and I, who were the more technical of the four of us, and Chris much more so than I, we had the chance to explain our vision and how it would work. And then there was this long silence, and then these top mainframe experts at Blue Cross turned to Tom Sherlock and said, I think these guys have a good idea, and I think microcomputers are the way to do it. And none of us really know much about microcomputers. Let's let these kids run with it. So Blue Cross actually funded us to start a company. By then I was a senior in high school. So in afternoons after my classes, and sometimes instead of my classes, I'm sorry to say, I would go to work with my partners. We would meet at my father's office. We would write business plans and think about how we could make this work with Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And then eventually it really came together. They actually put out a press release. And Elliot, maybe you could project the first slide for me here. So I don't know how well you can all see this, but my father called me once from the train station in New York. I think this, if I remember right, this was what says May 7th, 1985. And you see pictures of Ronald Reagan at the top of the screen. The front page of the New York Times on that day was Blue Cross Pioneers, a Pocket Medical History. And you can see the fingers, if I remember right, this would have been, I think it was Anne-Marie Lewandowski or one of our other then colleagues from more than 30 years ago, holding this card called Life Card. And my father said to me, your ideas on the front page of the New York Times, that's just insane. How can that even be possible? And and then things really just took off with this company. very quickly, and we started getting a lot of feedback and interest. I want to show, if we could go to the next slide. This is one of the brochure images that we had. I don't know if any of you are going to do a comparison between how I look now, but that was me at 17 or 18 years old. Then Dr. Hansen, a lovely, wonderful person who I miss. Our partner from Chicago, Stephen Taslitz. In the middle was Jim Thornton. He was the vice president of information systems at Blue Cross and Blue Shield. My brother Eric and Chris Hohensarg at the far right, and then the picture of Jim's wonderful assistant, Anne Marie. It is actually the picture you see on that extremely old IBM PC AT computer. And this is where we had a system to read and write the cards. You can actually see it there. At the time, by the way, the card had been invented, so the media of the card, but there were no devices to read or write the cards. So imagine if there was a compact disc, but nothing to play it on, or a DVD and nothing to play it on. I actually had to go to Japan. And I remember one of the top Blue Cross executives went with me to meet with companies to try to see if we could find somebody to manufacture this. And I went and visited with Chris, the CEO of Canon Corporation, and others. They did not know what to make of me. In Japanese culture, youth was not an attribute. And I remember the senior executive from Blue Cross and Blue Shield, they would direct their questions to him, and then he would turn to me and I would answer the questions. And they really were eager, I think, for me to be gone. But eventually they actually did agree to manufacture the device to read and write the cards. And then we started getting all sorts of inbound interest from people who wanted to use our system and technology and our hardware licenses and our license of the card technology. They wanted to use this for other applications. And it became pretty clear to Blue Cross, who owned the majority of LifeCard and funded us, that this, even if the medical card application didn't work, which it looked like it would, that this could be a very successful company. And they made us the proverbial offer that we couldn't refuse. And I remember my brother sitting down with me and he said, Blue Cross wants to buy our shares in the company. And to me, this was never about the shares in the company. I wanted everybody in America to be carrying this life card in their wallet. That's actually all I cared about. I didn't care whether we made any money, and the idea that they wanted to buy our shares was not a good thing. But he also explained to me, and I remember it was wonderful. He said, Doug, you're thinking of this as if we have an option. They are also funding our business. Today, they're offering us a lot of money. Tomorrow, they could just pull the plug and we don't have a company anymore anyway. And I thought, well, I can't really argue with that logic. And therefore, we did sell that company in 1988, I think, in 1985. So we started in 1983 and we sold it in 1985. And then I have one more slide I just want to show, which is from a couple years later, and I'll tell you what happened after that. That's a picture of Big Brother Eric and my father Gordon in an article. I don't even remember what magazine that was in, but it was about how he was an entrepreneur and his two boys were entrepreneurs too. And I remember, I remember standing there and having this picture taken at one of his Christmas decoration booths, and how proud I was to be there with my dad, and how much Eric and I wanted to make him proud of us, and our mom too. So I think, Elliot, from there, we could take the pictures down, and I'm going to just talk grindingly and boringly for a little while, and then we have a few more pictures at the end. So that was the LifeCard experience. And suddenly, and by the way, I didn't go to college. I had applied and eventually got accepted into Harvard, which sounded wonderful. But this opportunity felt to me like an opportunity of a lifetime. I had the chance to sit down with my parents and say, I think I'm going to defer going to college. And they were very supportive, I think a little bit shocked, but fairly supportive, because from my perspective, there was no way that this business was going to work. I was 17 years old. How could it possibly work? It was more that I was going to have a great adventure in business with my brother and my friends. And then it wouldn't work because that's probably what would happen. And then I would go to college. So I got a 1-year deferral to attend Harvard. At the end of that year, I wrote them and said, it's going pretty well. Can I have another year? They wrote me back and said, yes. And one thing I don't think I've mentioned to anybody in 30 years, one thing that really bothered me throughout that is, of course, I only had the acceptance certificate that they sent because I never attended. And they misspelled my middle name. And so they put down Douglas R. Becker instead of Douglas L. Becker. And it always bothered me because all I ever ended up having to show from this experience with Harvard was this, acceptance certificate, which the last time I saw was, how if you have a photo frame, a picture frame, sometimes you put multiple pictures in the same frame. And this acceptance certificate was like the first image in the frame. And then I had put a series of other photos over it, and I've never seen it again. So who knows where that ended up. After the second year, I asked them for one more deferment, and they declined. They said, if you're welcome to come right now and start classes. Otherwise, you have to reapply. And by then, our business had progressed, and I didn't look back. So a sidebar story on that, when my daughter Rose, who is on the line, who's a Georgetown student, her essay in applying to Georgetown was around her perception of education and how she considers her father to be an educated person despite never having gone to college. And I loved that essay, and have indeed, often said to her, you can go to college and not get an education. Please don't do that, by the way. Or you cannot go to college and get an education. So either of these paths can work, but I'm proud of her and what she's doing. So, and then I have a 15-year-old son. I think my wife, Erin, would be on the phone too. And I think we probably both were thinking he might be the one that might give us a harder time about whether he needs to go to college, since I didn't. We'll see. But I'm a big fan, and the rest of my comments today are going to be about my work in education. So it would be inconsistent of me to say anything other than university is incredibly, it is a gift to humanity. It truly is. So we had some capital. We had not expected to have capital. I mentioned before, I know people probably don't believe it, but I didn't really care about having capital. But we had it, and so we had to do something with it. And I think the goal was at that point how to not lose it. But we started investing in companies, and my brother Eric and our partner Stephen and Chris, they were much more adept at all of that. They found some interesting companies to invest in. But I was looking for my next passion. And at the time, I was thinking, the way I summarized the strange success of that lifeguard experience, and I don't want to gloss over the fact, by the way, I should mention that lifeguard product never came to market. Blue Cross and Blue Shield, when we left, they basically never made the product work. And I learned something very important there too. And I think it goes back to this question of what's the definition of an entrepreneur, in that I think a big company didn't have the mindset that we did of just sleeping and breathing and dreaming about this company and this product. And therefore, they never made it work. And I'm very confident we would have made it work. But by then, we were already on to our other chapters. So we started this investment company called Sterling Partners. I think it was 1987, around the time of that picture that you just saw with Eric and Gordon and me. And that was our investment company, a tiny little investment company. We were paid handsomely by Blue Cross and Blue Shield, but in today's terms, it actually was not a huge amount of money, but to us, it was all the money in the world. And we made some investments, and then I found my next passion. The way I had concluded, my conclusion about why Blue Cross even gave us this chance was that I figured everybody in the world who knew about computers knew more than I did. And everybody who knew anything about healthcare knew more than I did. But there was that 1 minute, that one happy moment when the intersection of the technology and the application, or certainly my partner Chris and our team, knew more than others did. Maybe not more than anyone, but we were in suddenly rare company, and just for a minute. And I thought that next minute might be in education. because in education, just as I saw this sort of frustrating lack of the application of new technology in healthcare back then, now healthcare is incredible in the way technologies are used. Education to me felt absolutely in the Stone Ages. And indeed, to some extent, even still today, there's a lot of chalkboard out there, and that's great. And there's nothing that will replace the human touch and connection between a teacher and a student, but there's a lot that technology can do. And so at that point, I raised my hand to my partners and said, hey guys, I think I've got the next idea. Let's do something in applying education to technology. Eric and Stephen decided to carry forward our investing company on behalf of the four of us. And Chris and I went on a search to find an education company to start or invest in or acquire. We found a little education technology company, believe it or not, a company that made a computerized Morse code training system, which I find so funny because, of course, they don't even use Morse code anymore, unless you're, trying to escape prison or something, sending you light signals to your, accomplices in the parking lot. I don't think anybody even uses Morse code anymore. But at the time, that was our product, and then from there, we morphed it into a lot of different businesses, and eventually, that we found our way. I found my way to Montgomery, Alabama, the home of Sylvan Learning Centers, a chain of tutoring centers, franchised tutoring centers, which was owned at the time by KinderCare, which and is a huge childcare, daycare company. And they had this very small but very interesting subsidiary in tutoring older kids. So daycare, meaning very young preschool children, but Sylvan was tutoring elementary, middle, high school students primarily in reading and math. And I was really, really excited by this company because it was very small. They were franchised. They had at the time, I want to say maybe 100 or 200 franchised locations, very small. The company was losing money. The franchisees were losing money. But what I loved when I sat in the tutoring center and watched students coming, it was clear that Sylvan had a method for teaching that worked. And it was small group instruction. It was diagnostic and prescriptive. So in that sense, something that like the health and medicine field that so many of you are in, and it worked. And at the time, KinderCare was going through a bankruptcy proceeding. Some of you may know that they were caught up in the Mike Milken bond debacle, junk bond debacle at that time. That's actually why Mike Milken went to jail. Of course, he's now been just recently pardoned by former president, whatever his name is. And therefore, suddenly KinderCare was going bankrupt, and we were able to make an offer to the bankruptcy court. So I think at the time I might have been 24. And we made an offer to the bankruptcy court and acquired what was initially 50% and then eventually 100% of Sylvan. We moved the company up to Baltimore. I remember it was about $10 million of revenue. To me, that felt like the biggest company on the planet. I mean, I thought I was a titan for a minute, and really was excited to be in charge of that company. Came in as the CEO of the company. It started to grow right away with just energy and love. And I think that's what the spirit of being an entrepreneur, just looking at every corner of this company and saying, how can we make it better? And there were wonderful people there, including several people who actually moved from Montgomery to Baltimore to help launch this company. And so this would have been 1991. By 1993, we had doubled the size of the company, and our old friends now at Alex Brown, many of you will remember that, of course, Alex Brown, famous in Baltimore, first investment banking firm in America, but they also at the time had taken AOL public, they had taken Microsoft public, and they came and knocked on our door and said, we think that we could take your company public. In retrospect, that was probably a terrible idea, but somehow in 1993, we went public. And we went public on the NASDAQ exchange, SLVN. By then, I would have been 27 years old and the CEO of a public company. It's again, now I'm sure that wouldn't be so unusual. You have these incredible tech entrepreneurs who start young and thrive. At the time, I might have been the youngest CEO of a public company in the United States. I think that might have been the case. That wasn't what mattered to me. What mattered to me was what we're going to do with this company. The fact that we had capital and momentum, and Sylvan at that time had expanded to maybe 500 tutoring centers, and the enrollments had scaled. And then we grew a lot, and Sylvan scaled to eventually 1,000 locations, 250,000 students, the largest company of its kind. We were advertising, so people knew us. We became a household brand, and Sylvan is still around. It's smaller today, and the world has changed, but it's still a wonderful company, helping tens of thousands of kids all over the country, and based out in the Towson or Timonium area today. So if there's anybody here that has any connection with Sylvan, please tell them I say hello. It's been a long time, but I love them still too. And we had to break through a number of challenges on this. I remember it was very funny. People used to always say, "Oh, Sylvan, we know all about you. We saw your advertisements on TV." And this was before we had ever run a television ad. I learned a lot, by the way, about brand and image and marketing, to know that people don't actually know where they've heard of you. And everybody knew that they'd heard of us from television when we had never run a single television ad. So that gave me an idea. We should probably run some television ads. We did, and Sylvan really thrived, again, because the product was so good, the people were so good. Probably my favorite story about when I realized that this was not just a scalable network, but that there were individual human stories. I was running, those of you who know me, running late for a flight. Very typical for me. And not recently, of course, with COVID, I've not flown too much, but I got to the counter, and the typical counter agent who was irritated that I was late, and I just handed her my corporate credit card that said Sylvan on it. And she actually literally burst into tears and said to me, "Oh my God, your company taught my son to read." And I was just overwhelmed by that individual. I'd spent a lot of time with parents, but this sort of completely random connection with somebody who just the name of my company made her have this emotional reaction and appreciation really allowed me to start connecting dots. The work I did on Lifecard was intended to create a product that would make things better for people. I didn't articulate that, but I felt it. The work I was doing at Sylvan was intended to do the same. And I started to see this pattern that had been there, but maybe never stated. So we had this tagline called "Success is Learned." I still love that expression. And then we actually moved Sylvan into schools. We went to the Baltimore City Public Schools and offered to essentially operate our tutoring centers at a much lower cost, where the school district could pay for kids to get the tutoring. That became very successful. And so Sylvan as a public company was just going from strength to strength. We then got to a point where we had a lot of technology capabilities because we were huge. We had 1,000 locations. My partner Chris and I remember we were talking about how we had a lot of excess capacity. The afternoons are when students would show up for tutoring. But until 4 or 5 in the afternoon, these centers, these 1,000 locations, were sitting empty. And so we came up with this idea of putting testing centers in the tutoring centers, so that if you wanted to take a standardized exam, like the MCAT, for example, for medical education, or the stockbroker's license, or the GMAT to apply to business school, you could come into our center, and we would give you a computerized exam that would give you an immediate score instead of waiting 6 weeks to get your score back. I don't know if, I'm sure you all remember filling out the little bubbles on those Scantron forms when you took the SAT or any other test. And you had to come in and take a test on the date that they published, which was usually 6 times a year. And you would wait 6 or 8 weeks to get your scores back. And we created through technology this computerized testing system. The company was called Prometric. It became the biggest testing company in the world. Just the spare capacity in our Sylvan tutoring centers. Thinking about being an entrepreneur, we had to put computers into all those Sylvan centers, and we didn't have enough money to do it. And I'll never forget calling the head of education for IBM, a wonderful man named Jim Dizel, and saying to him, Jim, we need thousands of computers that we can't afford. Would IBM finance us to provide these computers to us, which they did. And that's how Prometric was born. It became a big company, actually as big as the entirety of the rest of Sylvan. And actually in the year 2000, we were offered to sell that company. And we did for almost $1 billion. Not to us, I wish I could say it was to us, but to the public company. And then our public company that I was running had that capital, and we used that to start the next company I'm going to talk about in just a moment, called Laureate. But before I go to Laureate, I want to say, so public benefit, Sylvan's public benefit was empowering parents, empowering consumers, delivering great outcomes to students, giving parents choices, because the traditional public K through 12 system, which has many merits, but it oftentimes gives you what they want to give you as opposed to what you think you need. And a tutoring center like ours gave parents a choice that they had never had. I'm not talking about school choice, which is a politically charged idea. I just mean consumer choice, to let a parent say, my kid needs something and the school doesn't offer it, and I'm going to go get it. The Prometric testing business, that was a public benefit because we made testing convenient, made it easier for people to retake a test if they didn't do well the first time. Huge convenience, less anxiety. By our peak, we were delivering 9 million tests a year in Prometric, and it was global. It was all over the world. So the third chapter, which is Laureate, this is a great story. In Prometric, I was flying around the world setting up testing centers, because in the US, we could use our tutoring centers, but outside of the US, most countries, there was no Sylvan. And I was in Beijing, and I was walking by the Chinese embassy. And it was right around the time, right after, when the US bombed the Chinese embassy in Kosovo. And there were huge demonstrations in front of the American embassy because of this hostile act by the United States. But as I walked around the embassy, on the back side of the embassy was a line of literally thousands of people. And I asked somebody, what is that line? And they said, those are people who are in line to get a visa to come to the United States to go to university. And I was just so taken by the image. On the one hand, such outrage and anger at the United States, but on the other hand, this image of the United States as this mecca for higher education. And I really started asking myself, why are these people going to such lengths to come to the United States? What isn't available in their home country that maybe we could provide? And that's where the idea for Laureate came up, that we would take our experience with scale, with replicable process, with education and quality, with building and scaling organizations and hiring and training great people. And I had this idea of creating a global network of universities. We called it Sylvan International Universities. That didn't last very long. That became Laureate, which I think was a better name. And we ended up, I had a business plan that we would go to 10 universities in 10 years around the world with about 100,000 students. And if it all worked, it could be a $500 million revenue business and help provide access and quality in countries that didn't have it. It ended up being much bigger than anything I ever envisioned. At its peak, Laureate ended up with 1 million students, with 70 universities, 200 campuses, and 70,000 employees, almost 80,000 employees. So the way I describe that is, it was like taking a Great Dane for a walk. It was very clear I was just being dragged to wherever I was going to go, not necessarily in the front of the dog. But I learned a lot and eventually got my feet underneath of me, and that company became a wonderful, big, successful company. And we ended up divesting the other businesses I mentioned, like Prometric or Sylvan, because we needed the capital to invest in and scale the Laureate universities. And at a certain point, I felt that being a public company had become a liability, and that this mistrust, I started my comments today talking about the mistrust of business. Mistrust of business is bad if you're an oil company, but if you're an education organization, I used to refer to us as a company of educators. And because people just wouldn't believe that you could be a corporation and actually care about people or deliver a quality educational experience, which I know we did. So we went private because I actually felt that being public just exacerbated that image of the company as a financial enterprise and not as a company of educators. And then because we were actually doing a good job, you could study our outcomes and see that students, we were creating affordable education. Students were graduating and getting great jobs. There were no student loans because we kept our tuitions low. Average tuition at a Laureate university was between $2,000 and $4,000 a year, which would be out of reach for many people in countries like Mexico or Brazil or China or India, but was also within reach for many people who could have never come to the United States, period, and certainly not for that cost. And I remember at one point the World Bank, through their IFC investing arm, approached us and said, we'd like to invest in your company. Now, we were already, at that time, before we went private, a public company. But when we went private, we were able to approach them and say, yes, we'd like you to invest. That made the difference, that people would start seeing us as an entity that could attract investment from a group like the World Bank, which is intended to be about public good and not making money. We were able to attract incredible board members at Laureate still today. Judy Roden, who was the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the provost at Yale and the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, she was on our board. Bob Zellick, who was the president of the World Bank, was on our board. And we were building and building credibility, but I was still confronting this issue, especially in the US, where the idea of a for-profit company in the education sector was anathema to a lot of people. And I wanted to just demonstrate our willingness to be measured and scrutinized and analyzed. And I had this idea that we would apply for Laureate to become what was then and is today called a public benefit corporation. Some of you may have heard of this. You'll sometimes hear this referred to as a B Corp. But a public benefit corporation is it's a form of incorporation. Maryland was the first state in the country to offer this for a company that with a stated social purpose, social mission, and willing to go through an accreditation or a certification process that would evaluate whether you actually do what you say you do, how you treat your employers, your suppliers, the communities that you serve, the environment. And we put ourselves through this process and became a public benefit corporation. If I could go to the next couple slides, Elliot. There we go. So by this time, we had adopted this phrase called "here for good." I loved the idea that with that expression, we could say we're building a company to last, which is ironic because parts of Laureate didn't last, but the universities of Laureate are thriving all over the world. It's incredible. And so here for good, but also, of course, meaning here to benefit others. And you see the certified B Corp that was on the back of our annual impact report. And if you go to the slide just before that one, there you go. This is from the, I think maybe 2017 annual impact report we published. We were giving away $700 million a year of financial aid, of scholarships to students at the Laureate universities. What I learned, we were so big, we had 1 million students, and every classroom always had a few extra seats. We could always pull up a couple of extra chairs. Those couple of extra chairs ended up going to students that couldn't afford even our relatively low tuition. And we ended up at $700 million a year. I remember meeting with one of the heads of one of the biggest foundations in the world. And she said to me, you give away more than we give away. And we're one of the biggest foundations in the world. So that was an example of how we could do well and do good at the same time at enormous scale. We opened 19 medical schools. I know that would be interesting to Johns Hopkins. We actually have this brilliant physician leader who still works with me now in my new company, Francisco Gutierrez, who personally built a team to create a scalable, replicable process to make a high quality, affordable medical school in emerging markets. Just the clinics, dental and other health and medical clinics that we operated At its peak, Laureate was serving 720,000 healthcare services to about 150,000 people a year in poor villages in Mexico and Honduras and South Africa, really incredibly rewarding. And then at the time, just Laureate students, faculty, and staff were in that 1 year giving over 100,000 hours of volunteer times. I see this as actually 2015. And then, Elliot, if we go to the last slide, in 2017, I would say, with my arm twisted by some of the big investors in Laureate, we went public again. In the middle of that slide is Adina Testa, who is the CEO of NASDAQ and a Baltimore person. And some of you may know or have known David Testa from Tira Price, her father. Her brother went to Yeoman with me, so that was a nice Baltimore connection. That was our mayor, Catherine Pugh, in front there. And wonderful colleagues, including, I want to recognize, over my right shoulder, you'll see the face of a gentleman named Joe Duffy, who was one of my mentors, sort of the Rick Hansen, like he helped me with Lifecard. Joe Duffy helped me in the creation of Laureate. He had been the president of American University, the chancellor of University of Massachusetts. He'd been a very high official in the State Department, and he actually came in as our chief academic officer. He had by then retired and unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. But really a wonderful, happy moment. The company went public at that point, which was my moment to say, my work here is done. It had been 20 years. I had taken the company public twice, and we were a certified B Corp. We were, with this picture that you see, the very first public benefit corporation to IPO. There were no publicly traded companies that were also a public benefit corporation. And my hope is that even beyond Laureate, that opened the door for many, many other companies to follow our lead in that certification, accreditation, transparency, reporting of public benefit. So the public benefit of Laureate, access, social mobility, and most importantly, proving that excellence and scale can go hand in hand. And I know there are, I'm sure, some esteemed educators on this call. That is not a common point of view. Most people think that education needs to be handmade in small quantities in order to be good. And I just don't believe that. And I'd like to think that in some ways I've had the chance to prove that. So I hope you've seen some common threads here: solving problems, trying to have big ideas, always with a thread of doing something that might be helpful for others. Never perfect, always flawed. But again, I think part of the credo of an entrepreneur is you just keep going. And if you don't think it's good enough, that's actually what makes you better. And you just keep at it until you get to where you want to go. So Elliot, with that, if you think we could open up to some questions, I'd love to hear any thoughts or questions from any of your members of the audience. And I just want to thank everybody for their attention. Elliot, before I forget, I also want to say I thanked the whole Hopkins medical community. You have been a wonderful friend and support over the years. We were just talking before the call started about how Elliot helped do imaging on our son when he was 2 years old and had a lung anomaly that I think the audience would find fascinating, but we're not going to put that picture up right now. So anyway, Elliot, thank you for all of that.
Doug, that was wonderful. So people, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. But let me ask the first question while people are raising their hand. You know, being an entrepreneur, you know, if you look at your family, you look at your brother, is it something that's genetic? Is it gene?
Definitely not.
Or is it environment?
I think it's environment. I mean, I think there's also some, you know, luck involved, but I have to say, I think my brother and I definitely just observed our father start a company, grow a company, build a company, falter, get back up again. And I think that just had a huge impact on us. If people don't think something is possible, they never even consider it. I think about it like for first generation higher education students. If you don't know anybody that's ever gone to college, by the way, I'm not the right example for this, but if you don't know anybody that's ever gone to college, you may not think that college is attainable. I would say the same thing about being an entrepreneur. On the other hand, being an entrepreneur, there's also a huge factor of luck and a need for resources. So I'm not saying that it's a path that makes sense for anyone or everyone, but for us, Elliot, I think it was really just watching our father. And then my brother became somewhat the same beacon to me, in that he was the one reading business magazines and kind of connecting the dots of how you could actually get something done through the business world that at the time I hadn't even understood.
Okay, let me call this here. People are raising their hands. Norm Beauchamp. Norm is, hey Norm. You're on mute, Norm. Got to unmute yourself. Sorry. Oh, hold it. Maybe it's me. Ask to unmute. Norm. Okay, you're there.
I think I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Doug, I would just say you should see yourself as a world changer. The work you've done with Sylvan, Laureate, wonderful examples. You know, lack of access to education is one of the most important social determinants of health. And I mean, it's really remarkable. You know, when you think of kind of framing in your approach, entrepreneurship is a force for good. Entrepreneurship does unlock growth and creates value for end users, but it can be at painful adjustment costs for societies, right? It can impose a trade-off with shuttered companies, lost jobs, hurt communities. And yet you seem to have avoided that, right? You know, by, for example, I think Laureate is a good example. That looks like Cintana is going to do the same thing. So maybe you can speak to how you can be disruptive, but not destructive, because I think you really epitomize that in how you've gone about what you've done.
It's a very interesting question, and thank you for that. It is.
Yep. Sorry.
Look, I got lucky in that I have mostly been trying to create markets. Like, tutoring was a mom and pop exercise, but actually most people never used a tutor. And I don't think that Sylvan took market share away from the average tutor. I think we grew the market. Laureate, for sure, we grew the market. And I'll just take one quick moment and tell you a great story. Years ago, I was summoned to go meet the Minister of Education in Mexico. And I was dreading it a little bit. I wondered what we had done wrong. And I went and met this wonderful young leader who passed away, unfortunately, after that. And he had on his desk a chart. And he said, Mr. Becker, I just want you to see this chart. Did you know that in the last 5 years, 20% of all the increased capacity to offer higher education in Mexico, your company produced,
wow,
which
awesome.
cost us billions of dollars to do. But I was shocked that anybody noticed. You know, we were doing it. It was good for people. I didn't even think government would care. Sometimes government, by the way, didn't have that positive view, but he sure did. So I think I was a little bit lucky in that mostly I was focused on things about growing the market. And you're right. I mean, there are certainly entrepreneurs who create what they think of as a better mousetrap that just shifts share from incumbents. And I don't know that I think that's bad. I mean, if you're Tesla and you're taking market share from GM, you're probably poking the beast and waking them up, or they sleep at their peril. But I would just say I personally have felt better being involved in trying to grow markets than just take market share.
Yeah, I think if I may, it's like Clay Christensen's work. The disruption is one of the reasons, though, why big organizations don't innovate, right? And so it's trying to figure out how you do that at a place like Hopkins or a large university that transforms, but doesn't necessarily injure. And I just really appreciate your approach.
Thank you.
Okay. Ralph, let me see if I can get this to work. Ralph, did I do that right? Ralph, here, let me see if I need to allow to talk. Okay, Ralph, you have to unmute.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ralph, we can.
Yeah, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I love the combination of not giving up and doing good. A beautiful idea. When you're a small company, it's you and your brother. I can see how you can maintain the doing good. But as you get bigger and bigger, and you talked about going public, how can you maintain that and maintain the control of that vision?
Well, in a way, it's a great question. In a way, I kind of lost control of that vision in that Laureate eventually became so big that there was so much capital, so much financial capital involved, that we had investors who they were willing to tolerate the idea that I had something in mind other than making money, but they didn't like it. And eventually they got to a point where they felt that the Laureate universities, 70 of them, had each advanced so much in their scale and their excellence that they would be worth more sold apart than as a company together. So in that sense, I did lose control of that. And that's when I left the company after we went. I kind of knew when we were going public that that was, kind of the end of that ride. But I will say, what I've learned is a beautiful thing is that, so Laureate itself is now much smaller. They were in 29 countries. They're now in 2, but still doing great work. But, very many articles that, indicate that they will probably just sell out the remainder and distribute capital to shareholders. As a founder, hardly what I had in mind. But I keep in touch with all those universities that used to be Laureate universities. And I realize our legacy is actually that community of universities that have been incredibly successful. This is now our university in Chile, is the largest university in Chile and the biggest recipient, a private university recipient of government research grants in their country. Our university in Mexico is the largest private university. Our second university in Mexico is the second largest university in the country. Just wonderful. So my point was, I do think even when you end up with, kind of capitalism winning, I think we still actually were able to win in other terms in ways that's really rewarding. And then my last point, you mentioned, this might have been easier when we were a small company. Actually doing good, that whole Here for Good slogan for Laureate was an incredibly aligning framework. Everybody in the company knew about it, and I do really believe cared about it. And we backed it up. I mean, we built playgrounds. We would do a lot of volunteer work. People saw that we were giving away hundreds of millions of dollars of scholarships. The way I like to put it is we were painting shut every public school window in Baltimore, because we would all go in as volunteers and paint windows and do it badly. But we were really in the community, really trying to live our purpose, and everywhere. I mean, in Turkey and in India and all these places around the world. So I do think actually that Here for Good was a unifying force that allowed me to run a large company where everybody understood why we were there. And it wasn't just to make money for shareholders. And eventually, after 20 years, some shareholders, that wasn't what they wanted anymore. But I would say, and that's why I'm doing it differently this time, which is maintaining more economic or financial control over the company that I've started now that I can afford to, so that I don't really have that same pressure from outside investors.
So can I ask a question? My daughter sent me a question. She couldn't be on the call right now, but in terms of entrepreneurship, classically you think about a male being an entrepreneur. Females have had more of a challenge. I mean, what's your feeling on that, and how is that changing? I know that one of our prior speakers who couldn't be here tonight, Jenny Abramson, who runs, I think she is the largest venture fund that only invests in companies that women lead. And she said that's like 2% of venture capital. Do you think that's changing, or is there a way for women to get involved the same way?
I think it's a great question. I think about that with my daughter on the line, and I'm sure if you asked her, she would say, I can be an entrepreneur. I mean, it'd be her choice if she wants to, but I don't think she would even consider that that's not possible for her if she wanted it. Look, part of that, Elliot, as you know so well, is about STEM. There's still not as much engagement in terms of enrollment of women and girls in STEM programs. Now that's changed a lot and getting much better. And so I think it'll go in waves, because a lot of venture capital and entrepreneurship is based in that sort of tech world. I mean, let's face it, I was, in many senses, you would say, uneducated from a classic sense in terms of how I learned how to be a technology person. But it was a tech endeavor. And so if women feel left out of starting a business or of tech, but I see that changing very dramatically. I can just answer you. Look at the president of NASDAQ, the CEO of NASDAQ in that picture I showed you. You want to talk about literally the old boys club. That was, that investment banking and stock exchange industry. Mortimer from Trading Places with Eddie Murphy. What an old white man's world that was. And wonderfully now, of course, I think that's changing in so many ways. So I'm very optimistic. I don't think, look, I just read a couple weeks ago, you probably all saw the public offering of Bumble, which is a dating app for women. And the founder of that is this remarkable young entrepreneurial woman leader. Coursera, which is a company some of you may know, an education company. I actually, at Laureate, had the chance for us to be one of the first investors in Coursera for Laureate, not myself. And that was founded by Daphne Kohler, who is a professor at Stanford and female entrepreneur and leader. I think I don't even think, I'd love to think for your daughter that her daughter will not even ask that question. So fingers crossed.
Okay. Any last questions here? Let's see. I know Chris Wilkins, New York. Chris, I thought I'd raise his hand. Chris. Let's see if I did this right. Chris?
Thanks, Elliot. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me and allowing the NYU group to be a part. I have a couple of faculty sitting in the office, and I really don't have a question other than to say we're simply blown away. This was amazingly inspirational. And I mean, I think there's so many lessons to be learned, but the thing that is really underscored for me is two things. It's having passion for something and be driven by doing the right thing. And with those two things and the right mind, it's just amazing what you can accomplish. So I just want to congratulate you. It's been a wonderfully inspirational talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your taking the time to hear it.
Okay, Doug, so I can say, I'll give you the last word, but I think what's really, I think all of us, at some point think about entrepreneurship or doing something special. I think the passion, as you mentioned, is there, but it's always that, it's like a hidden barrier that stops you from going all in. I remember Steve Jobs used to, when I was doing stuff with Pixar and I was in Hopkins, and Steve said, I explained how I was going to do this, that, and the other. And Steve said, you only can serve one master. If you want something, you have to go all out. And I think that maybe is one of the great lessons that from your story is that there's no halfway. No halfway.
I think you're right. Look, I think Steve Jobs is an interesting example. I don't know how important it was to him to help people, but it was important, and maybe it was, I just don't know, but it was important to him to change the world. It was important to him to think big, to make things possible that hadn't been possible in the past. I mean, he was obviously an entrepreneur at a level beyond anything I will ever do, and what an iconic figure. But I would say he was also the person famous for painting the inside of the computers. And people would say, nobody looks at the inside of the computers. And he would say, but I would know if that is unfinished or looks bad. So maybe my quest to do something that would help people was his equivalent of caring about something other than just making money, was a passion for product excellence and breakthrough innovation. And for me, I hope those things were as well, but also a passion that I could do something that would make a difference in people's lives. Just going back to that idea, how disappointed I was that people weren't going to carry that life card in their pockets, because I thought that was going to be the rest of my life, was being the person that actually got people to get through their check-in process better and not get conflicting, prescriptions that would harm their health and not repeat costly medical procedures that weren't needed again. I really thought that's how I was going to make an impact in the world. I feel so lucky that I had another way to do it, but that was important to me. And I guess the other point I'd make is I don't think there are very few people that I think go into business hoping to harm people. I think there's just people take shortcuts. And look, one thing I am empathetic of is there can be a whiff of desperation in a company that's failing that drives people to do the wrong thing, to cut corners, to dilute their product in some way, or to do the wrong thing. And I didn't end up there, but you could see it from where I was. In other words, there were desperate moments where I was faced with temptations to do things that would have been wrong. And I come away not feeling superior because I didn't. I come away actually with a sense of empathy for people that are put in that position. And I think when people go wrong with their business, it's usually not because they were evil or even greedy, but like in my case, it wasn't so important to me about how much money I could make, but I ended up feeling this responsibility for all these people that worked for me that chose to throw in with me on these, sort of Quixote-like adventures. And I would never want to let them down. And so that's a lot of pressure. And I guess my point is to say, I think the opposite of doing good isn't necessarily evil. It may be error. It may be that people get in over their heads. So in that sense, I do think I also was lucky in that I saw desperate moments, but I was always able to kind of escape them and never had to make some of these choices. The ridiculous extreme, the John DeLorean selling cocaine to keep his factory alive, obviously not good and not smart. But I do think people who try to start something, they're the flip side of that relentless entrepreneurial drive can be to never give up and do whatever it takes. And that can make people do bad things. And I feel very lucky to have never ultimately been put in a position where I had to do that, because that would have been to be tested in a way that I can't really say that I was. So anyway, Elliot, just thank you so much. Thanks everybody for taking the time to listen to me drone on, and I really appreciate the invitation, Elliot.
That was just so wonderful. I do it again. I owe you a dinner at the Charleston when
you got it.
Dan
You got it.
Up and I want to ask your mother who gave a better talk, but she gave thumbs up to everybody.
I can only tell you, vaccinated and ready. So when you're ready, I'm ready. Thank you all very much.
Okay. Thanks, Stefan.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.